Hello, dear listeners. Guess what? Starting in July, Bookable is moving to Tuesdays. That's right. We are packing up from Sunday and moving on. We love Sunday. Sunday treated us well. But Tuesday just gets us, you know? So mark your calendars and we'll see you on Tuesdays.
For me, in terms of who I am and who I was, I think it only could have come as a result of this kind of maniacal, single-minded devotion to the craft. And like I say in the book, I have mixed feelings about that.
Do you like books?
I'm outlining a new writing project.
Who wrote this book?
Read it. What are you reading?
Sometimes I'd write something.
What are you writing?
Have you written anything lately?
I'm Amanda Stern, and this is Bookable. On today's show, let's get neighborly. Have you been getting closer to your neighbors during quarantine? Well, for today's guests, it's not just the pandemic that's bringing them together. It's their shared love of craft. Novelist Julie Orringer was on Bookable earlier this year, and we talked about her incredible book, The Flight Portfolio, and I'm delighted she's back for this bonus conversation. When I asked her who she wanted to talk to, she said her neighbor, who happens to be New York Times best-selling cartoonist and illustrator Adrian Tomine. Julie and Adrian live in the same building in Brooklyn, but they're talking on the phone while she's in Maine and he's back home taking care of her houseplants. Adrian's newest book is an illustrated memoir called The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Cartoonist, and it comes out on July 21st. In this conversation, they talk about everything from craft to mentorship to graph paper. It's poignant, informative, and deeply interesting. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did.
This is Julie Orringer. I'm speaking to you from Blue Hill, Maine, where I'm sitting in Jonathan Letham's study and speaking to Adrian Tomine, who is, ironically enough, my upstairs neighbor. So a few days ago, Adrian and I were just separated by a few feet, and now we're 453 miles apart. But thanks to Bookable, the amazing new podcast hosted by my friend, the incredible writer Amanda Stern, we are now connected via Skype, Blue Hill, Maine to Brooklyn, New York, and we're going to be talking about writing in the pandemic and being neighbors in Brooklyn, and especially about Adrian's new book, The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Cartoonist, which is going to be out when, Adrian? Very shortly, right?
July 21st.
Okay, so it's coming right up. Yeah. Just to give a little bit of personal background, Adrian and I have known each other for kind of a long time. We had a bunch of friends in common when we were both living in the Bay Area. And then we ran into each other at a playground in Brooklyn where our kids were both playing. And it turned out that Adrian was looking for a new apartment and our upstairs neighbors were moving out of theirs. And so Adrian ended up becoming my upstairs neighbor. So we've lived under the same roof for how long now, Adrian? 3 or 4 years?
I think at least, yeah, maybe 4 years. And I will always be grateful to you for making that effort and coming over and saying hi to me and then hooking us up with this apartment, because like you said, we were essentially, I guess in a very gentle way, getting evicted from an apartment, and we needed to move quickly. And I am also very picky, as you can imagine, and so I'd been house or apartment hunting for several weeks and feeling very despondent. So it really was like a kind of a just out of the blue miracle where I went home and said to Sarah, like, hey, this is the weirdest thing, but I think I found an apartment for us. And and now we're here.
Well, New York housing serendipity is rare, so I'm really glad that I played a part in that.
It's true. I would hate anyone else who told that story, probably.
That's funny. But the great thing now is that we can house all of our writing insecurities under one roof.
Yes.
Which, I realized in a kind of a more acute way when I read your new book, where you speak so eloquently and in so many different ways about how we're beset by embarrassment and shame as we make our way into writing lives. And so it was funny to me as I was reading this book because I was thinking about how shortly after you published Killing and Dying, which is your fairly recent story collection, you said to me, Julie, no, this was such a pain in the ass. I think I'm basically never going to write another book.
Yeah.
And then not too long after that, you were working on another book, and now you've finished yet another book. And so I guess I'm curious to know how you traveled the path from being fed up with writing books to feeling as though it was a necessity again, and then producing this book, which I just have absolutely loved.
Well, thanks. I mean, I feel like I hope that you have sometimes have had a similar experience, but I always feel like whenever I finish a book that might be it for me. Like this has been happening for the last at least 3 or 4 books, that whenever I finish it, I think, wow, that might be it for me, and I'm gonna fulfill my fantasy of working at a newspaper kiosk in the subway station or something. And I think, I don't know, I guess maybe it would be different if I had a different working method or a different style that made the process more fun on a day-to-day basis or more relaxed. But it always ends up feeling kind of grueling and again, you can probably speak to this, but especially having young kids, sometimes it feels like that the idea of completing a book is just like an impossible dream. And so, yeah, is that, or do you always feel just energized and ready to move on to the next thing? I'm curious.
Well, first of all, no way. I always feel completely enervated by the idea of starting something new. It just seems insurmountable, especially because having young kids, you have already seen the distance. If you've finished a book while having young kids, which I've somehow managed to do, you've seen the distance that you need to travel. And so I'm just embarking on a story collection now, and also somehow in the midst of that started a new novel. And I just don't.
My gosh.
I don't know how, especially under the current circumstances, I will walk that path from here to there. But then there is something that keeps me doing the research I need to do and putting words on the page, and it kind of feels like it has to do with the impetus of the story itself. And in the case of the loneliness of the long-distance cartoonists, it seems like what was creating that drive was a desire to capture just how many kind of psychological pitfalls there are, or how many times events conspire to show you your own smallness or the limitations of what you're able to do compared to what you aspire to do. And I wonder if we can talk a little bit about how you moved from the fiction you were writing before this to that autobiographical subject. I mean, this is a memoir.
Well, I mean, the simplest answer is just that I kind of try and move in a different direction from book to book, at least in the last few books of mine, where I felt like I did a graphic novel with shortcomings, and then I wanted to do short stories again with Killing and Dying. And then when I finished that book, I actually had a handful of other ideas for more short stories, but I had the feeling like that, it would be sort of, I didn't know how much appetite there would be for just something that felt kind of like a leftovers from killing and dying. So I wanted to do something as different as at least I'm capable of within my limits. And so the idea for this book has been in the back of my mind for a long time, and I thought this would be a good time to do something that was in black and white, and that instead of color, and that was autobiographical instead of fiction, and that was drawn loosely, kind of in a sketchbook style rather than meticulously in a illustration style, I guess. So I just wanted to both for my own sanity, and also a little bit thinking about how what an imagined audience might be tired of from me, or what they might be excited what they might be excited about.
Yeah, well, I really love the way the book has this kind of formal intimacy that goes along with its thematic intimacy. So when you read the book, which I hope everybody's going to do, you'll see, first of all, that it's written on graph paper, as if it were a notebook, and it seems, I feel like I haven't seen that before as a cartoonist representation of the memoir form. It's as if, in addition to being let into your mind, we're actually being led into your book, which is so incredible. I mean, this is one of the benefits of living downstairs from you, that I feel like sometimes I actually get to see a glimpse of your work in progress.
Yeah.
But I think that that's something we don't really usually get to see. And so, first of all, that was one of the things that I thought was really great, that creates this real kind of intimacy between the reader and you as the writer. But I wonder if that also comes with a certain feeling of exposure. I mean, in a sense, you're still controlling in every way what appears on the page, but when your material is your own life, you're allowing in, I think, a certain degree of messiness, or of just kind of raw honesty that maybe isn't there in the same way when you're writing fiction. Yeah.
Well, to address the graph paper thing, there's the most practical reason for it was that I didn't feel like I had the strength and the energy to draw another book in the way that I had drawn Killing and Dying, which was in a lot of places kind of like almost doing a New Yorker illustration for each panel, and coloring it. And I thought, I'm not going to be able to do that, especially right now with the ages that the kids are at and everything. And so in a way, the idea of the graph paper, I thought, was sort of a way to excuse a looser, rougher style of drawing, to make it to make something that was going to be easier for me seem intentional and meaningful, like that it was as if torn directly from my real sketchbooks. And the other reason behind that was that there are some cartoonists who draw their work on graph paper, but then when they scan it, they do it as a black and white scan, and the blue graph lines disappear, and you just see the black artwork. And so the blue lines were basically just like a guide for them. And a few times I've actually seen the original artwork on the graph paper, and I always thought, oh, that looks so cool, like that. Like I wish, they, or someone had just shot it in that way, which is, I guess, a little more expensive. But so that was sort of in the back of my mind too. I just aesthetically, I liked the look of it, and then it ended up fitting, I guess, well with what you're describing, the more intimate kind of introspective content of this book.
Yeah, but it's cool how that it also carries an element of the circumstances of your life, because it's part of the story that you're telling about yourself, to say, my life now is constituted such that I need to work in a way that's easier for me in this particular sense to get the work done, because I think that's part of the difficulty. You and I, the other night, were having a socially distanced drink in front of our house, and we were talking about the fact that Zadie Smith has an essay collection coming out soon, one that she wrote during the pandemic. And when I read a little bit about the collection, I came across something where she herself was talking about those pieces and saying, these pieces are short and they're kind of rough because these were the circumstances of my life at the time. I didn't have a lot of time to edit, and the pieces came out short because I didn't have a lot of time to write. And I guess there's something about the way that we're trained, if we're trained sort of by the kind of perfectionist writers and professors who tend to teach, and who I tended to study with, who would sort of argue against that in a way and say, well, revise everything until it's completely set. But then there's another argument to be made for capturing a particular moment, like Zadie is doing, or for writing our lives the way they are, with a bit of their difficulty and messiness intact.
Yeah, I think that one of the unintended outcomes of this book was, or at least it wasn't what I thought of when I started the book, was, to me, it really feels more like a snapshot of what my life is right now, and I sort of think of all the rest of it as the path that brought me to this point. And so yeah, I think it works in that regard. And like I said, I think I started out with just the early part of the book in mind, like the anecdotes and the jokes, which after about 100 pages, I noticed that Sarah's reaction to each new page was getting more and more muted. And finally, and finally, I think she said, the stuff is great, but is this going to just keep going? Is it, I know you said it was going to be like 200 pages. Is it 200 pages of this same kind of humiliation, embarrassment joke over and over again? And then, and I by that time I'd already had a plan. So I said, no, just wait, because I think it's going somewhere. And that's part of the reason why, when I was working on it, my publisher wanted to start sending out advanced pages just to get interest in it going. And I said, but starting as early as like halfway through the book. And I said, you know what, I think people should read the whole thing. And I think that if you just read the beginning part or you read the end part, they seem like kind of two incomplete things. And I want people to experience it together. So we held on to the pages until the whole thing could be sent out intact.
Well, that is such an interesting point that you bring up. I mean, there are a couple of things I want to talk about in what you just said. First of all, that you have an in-house critic. I mean, you're showing things to Sarah, your wife.
More than one, actually. My
well, that's right.
Oldest daughter, Nora, is also a reader as the work is in progress.
Oh, that's amazing. So Nora is now 11, right?
Not yet. She's 10. So.
Oh, she's still 10. Okay. Some of what you're writing is pretty intense. I mean, I know that she's a super avid reader and is reading some stuff that's pretty advanced for a 10-year-old. But at what point did you decide that you could start showing stuff to her? I mean, she must have seen you and Sarah, talking about it and thinking about it together. But I'm curious to know when. I mean, Jacob just read one of my short stories for the first time, and I must say it was really anxiety-producing.
Wow.
He read that story called Note to Sixth Grade Self, and I just thought, oh my God, like how is my own kid going to react to this work? Representation of kids who are a little bit older than him, but sort of close to his age.
And how did that go?
Well, it was pretty good, I mean, it was really interesting to actually be able to talk to him about what was going on in that story, which has been a part of my mind for a long time now. But I also thought, oh God, well, is he telling me what he really thinks?
Yeah. Well, you, I think, have a slight advantage in that there's nothing inherently like if kids can just tune out words on a screen or pieces of paper with typing on it, especially if they're not, fully a full reader yet. So I'm sure you didn't have to like slam your laptop closed when one of your kids walked into your room or something like that.
Right.
But for me, it's harder to hide because since I work from home and I have sort of trained my kids to be comic book fans from an early age, and so of course when they see comics being drawn in their apartment, they're a little bit tantalized. So it really with Nora was just a practical thing that I'm actually grateful that I was working on Killing and Dying, which has probably more adult content to it, when she was so young and was either oblivious or I could easily hide it from her. But at this point, it's way too much trouble to try and hide anything from her because it's pages are pinned up on the wall above my desk,
Right.
and she just likes comics. I mean, it doesn't matter who drew it, but if she sees something in that format, she's going to be drawn to it. So she pretty much read every page of the new book as I was completing it, and then at a certain point, I think I was about 3/4 of the way done with drawing the finished pages, and I came into my studio, and she was sitting there, and she'd found the little Itoya folder that I had the rough draft in,
Oh, wow.
and was reading the pages that I hadn't done the final draft of yet because she was sort of curious about how the book was going to end. So she skipped ahead into the rough draft and finished reading it.
Wow, that's amazing. So she appears in the book. I mean, she's an important character.
That's part of the draw for sure. her interest definitely increased when I got to the chronology that involved her.
And have you guys talked about how she feels about that? About being represented in your work, work that's going to be published and read by thousands of people. I mean, how is that talked about in your household, or how does she conceive of that?
I know it's different in other families, but in this one, I'm actually the voice of reason, the one who's making kind of ethical calls and saying, no, I don't think I should include that anecdote. I don't want to expose you in that way, because at least at this point in her life, she would love nothing more than to be famous and to be recognized. and to have people say that they thought something she said in a comic was funny or something like that. So
Wow.
I'm actually kind of more of the voice of reason, and I definitely made some editorial choices along the way about what to include and how, mainly like detail too. Like I didn't want to be too specific about where she goes to school or people who like ancillary characters. Like I didn't want to include friends of hers by name or anything like that.
Right, because you're protecting her privacy too.
I'm trying to, yeah.
Yeah. So I want to go back now for a second to the second part of what we were talking about earlier when you mentioned not wanting to show the book piecewise. And I'm coming back there sort of by way of Nora being interested in following out the trajectory of the book.
Right.
This book, as we've talked about it before, you see it as a series of anecdotes that end in a kind of punchline. And I must say that as I was reading the book, I laughed out loud at the end of every section. I was like
great.
Beside myself sometimes because it's just like, oh, could it be any worse? There are things like you're at a restaurant with Sarah, who you're just dating at the time.
Yeah.
And there are a couple of people sitting next to you who start talking about your book.
Yeah.
And the man in the conversation starts talking about it in this very intelligently disparaging way.
Right.
And it's very awkward, and you move to the sushi bar instead of the tables, and then Sarah just becomes enraged.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it just one after another of these situations where it's just like, it just sounds so horrible. Or like an earlier situation where you're being interviewed by by a journalist who happens to be an attractive young woman. And you guys go on a walk after your conversation at a diner. And you have not yet realized at that point in your life that you're lactose intolerant, and you've just eaten some, eggs Benedict with extra hollandaise and a large latte. And things don't go so well on that walk. Right. And I just kept thinking, oh my God, like we've all had these experiences that are horribly embarrassing, but to have them accrue the way they do in this book, one after the other, and then to be followed, if I can speak about this without giving anything away, with a kind of moment of real existential reckoning, kind of caused me as a reader to start thinking, well, what is it for? Why are we pursuing these things that seem so important to us? And what context do they have? And, as we look at the rest of our lives, how do they contextualize our relationships and everything else that is and should be important to us?
Yeah.
I guess the question that I'm trying to ask here is whether you feel like this book really belongs to a particular moment in the development of your life as an artist, because it kind of seems like one of the things that is remarkable about these stories that you're telling is that even though as you evolve in your writing life and as you sort of become more renowned and as more people have read your work, one thing that remains consistent is the kind of acuteness and depth of embarrassment that seems to sort of chase you through your writing life.
Yeah.
And I guess it felt like a really, it felt like a really grown-up book in that sense, in the sense that like we maybe we recognize as we get older that what we hope to shed when we're just starting out in some art or some career, all the insecurities that we think we can leave by the wayside are kind of part of who we are.
Yeah.
And that seemed to be a very strong line running through the book. But I just wonder how that comes up against your reckoning with mortality that enters later in the narrative.
Yeah. I mean, I think, this was the least calculated and premeditated book that I've ever done. So in other words, I really didn't 100% know where I was going to end up when I started working on it. And a lot of it was sort of developed in progress, which is something that I've always been very nervous about doing. I'm generally a meticulous planner. And I think it was, I guess it's I'm sort of thinking out loud on paper as the book progresses. And I guess I just was at some point realized that I was heading towards the real challenge was going to be arriving at the sort of ambiguous conclusion that I've reached about my career and my work, and I think that it ended up being a little bit of a balancing act. Like I think that if I just showed all the funny humiliations, then the judgment would land on the side of like, well, yeah, it was kind of a waste, and what's the point? And then if I just did a portrait of my present day life with my happy family and my pleasant work environment and my nice career and everything, it would seem like a brag or something. And so I wanted to really have both those sides, and in a way, I feel like this was a story that would have been useful to me when I was an aspiring cartoonist,
right?
Because I really pinned everything on the idea of becoming a cartoonist. I was sure that it would be the source of income and friendship and happiness, and in a lot of ways it did bring me that, but it never in my wildest dreams did I predict any of the other the other things that I detail in this book.
But do you think that going all in like you did was necessary in a way to arriving where you are now ultimately?
I mean, yes, to arrive at the very specific place where I am, but and I used to extrapolate from that and think that that was true of all aspiring cartoonists, and I've since been proven very wrong, and I've revised that thought, because there are people who've decided to become cartoonists later in life, or with a more balanced life, and have ended up producing great work. But for me, in terms of who I am and who I was, and the very specific point that I am at, I think it only could have come as a result of this kind of maniacal, single-minded devotion to the craft. And I say in the book, I have mixed feelings about that. I mean, it's kind of too late for me to ever devote that much attention to any other pursuit. I mean, there's just not enough time in my life now for me to do that much, to be on one path like that.
Yeah. Well, if I can sort of open up the perspective just a little bit on that, I feel like you are also deeply devoted to your life as a parent, which is something I see every day living downstairs from you. You know, right. I mean, I think that one of the evolutions in this book that I find really interesting is the way your attention becomes organically divided between your work and your parenting. And there's actually a marvelous scene that I feel approaches this. Oh, there are a number of them later in the book, but one that I think approaches this idea really directly is when you and Sarah are in Penn Station with Nora when Nora's a toddler. Yeah. And she starts to have a tantrum because she wants a certain snack, and you and Sarah are sort of trying to figure out how to help calm her down and give her what she wants without her giving her the sense she's gotten it by having a tantrum. Right. And there's another commuter, an elderly woman, who starts commenting on your parenting, and at the very same time, you're approached by a fan who starts commenting on your work, and then starts talking to you about a fellow cartoonist's work. It just is such a brilliant confluence of those two powerful streams in your life right now, which, any of us who are working as parents right now feel especially acutely as we try to navigate those demands during the pandemic. I mean, do you feel like you talked a little bit about how your work life changed as you became a parent? Do you feel like you can point to things that are significantly different now from before?
I think, I mean, in terms of what's different, the main thing is the fact that for many years of my life, I had too much free time. I had, sometimes weeks at a time of just being alone and working. I lived by myself in an apartment in Berkeley. And I would just go for long stretches of, maybe once a week I'd go out and meet some friends for lunch or something. And then other than that, I was locked in that apartment, and, working and wasting time. And now that's completely gone. And I have to carve out time and really kind of struggle to find quiet. And I guess the shock for me is that my level of output is about the same. I didn't become suddenly, slower or less prolific. That the drawings didn't drop off in their, meticulous quality or whatever. And
Right.
so that was a shock.
Sure. But you're managing your time a lot differently now.
Time for a short break. When we come back, Julie and Adrian talk about knowing who they are as writers and draw inspiration from a Times Square dwelling recluse. Stick around. Failure, anger, and even wrinkles are always tricky things to grapple with and accept. But as you get older, you begin to learn how to embrace it all because you know everything will be fine. Join former Lucky Magazine founding editor Kim France and documentary filmmaker Tally Abacassis as they give us an inside look as to how they're navigating life after 40 in the podcast, Everything is Fine. Kim and Tally have honest conversations with guests about their fears, health, careers, self-care, and how to navigate being called middle-aged when they feel anything but. Whether it's what to do about gray hair, tips on always looking well-dressed, overcoming being fired, or discussing the power of being pissed off. They're always empathetic, insightful, and most of all, entertaining. Subscribe to Everything is Fine wherever you listen to podcasts. Welcome back to this Bookable bonus conversation with Julie Orringer and Adrian Tomine.
So much of what you're talking about, I think, has to do with your deep knowledge of who you are as a writer and as an artist. And I was listening to Susan Choi and Jenny Egan talking about their processes together on one of the earlier episodes of this podcast. And Jenny was talking about the importance of kind of being in the flow, of just sort of being patient with one's own process and with the way one's own work has to unfold, which seems to me like it requires a lot of self-knowledge and patience with oneself. But I was really also struck as I was reading this book by the way you seem to know yourself, not only psychologically, but also physically. I'm just fascinated by this because as I was looking at the way you render yourself on the page, like the way your shirt hangs on your shoulders, or the way your arms hold tension against your knees as you lean forward, or the way your own eyebrow raises in a particular expression of surprise as you're talking to somebody, I just felt like I was seeing you so accurately in a way that I could not conceive of how you could possibly have seen yourself, you know. And there's this marvelous scene in the book where you're at Carnegie Hall having this interview with Terry Gross for Fresh Air. And you have a kind of out-of-body experience. The way you render it on the page, you kind of like rise up genie-like out of your own body, and you're watching yourself from a corner of the room. And I kept thinking, my God, like that's how he can do it. You know, he can see himself from outside. But I really would love to hear you talk about how you know yourself physically well enough to be able to render your own expressions and your own gestures so clearly, even apart from the acute psychological rendering that exists in this book.
I have to wonder if it isn't just the sort of physical version of what all writers, even, you know, poets or prose authors are trying to do. I mean, I feel like even in your most your stories that are very different of yours from your present day circumstance, I'm sure you're imbuing it with your own thoughts, your own personality, and in a way bringing these fictional characters to life by giving them a little bit of your DNA or your blood or your thoughts.
Right.
And I feel like that is what always brings writing alive for me. Like, whether it's explicitly autobiographical or not, I really respond to personal work, you know, even if it's a fantasy story or a science fiction story, but if I feel like the author is really trying to put themselves into it and trying to figure out things about themselves, that's what's going to make it a compelling read to me, way more than the plot elements or anything like that. And I think that's something that I tried to do in my fiction comics. And so it felt very natural, and in a way I could have a few steps less of masking that process with this book, where I could just be very, very direct in that process. And I think, you probably have a better insight into some of those things that I'm aiming for in the physical depictions, because you seem going up and down the stairs every day. But I don't know, my hope is that still transmits something to someone who's never met me before, and that they because there's so many books that I've read, and my life never overlapped in history with the writer, but I feel like, oh, that's them speaking from their heart here, or that's something that really occurred and they had to put it down on paper or something like that.
Oh, yeah, I totally agree with everything you've just said. I just don't know how you execute it physically, Adrian. I just don't know how you literally do it. I mean, that's one of the things that makes it really fun for me to know artists who work in other media, because there's something that's just, I can imagine how to you it feels natural to move from inhabiting your own body to rendering your own body.
Yeah.
But to me, as somebody who doesn't work very often in visual media, there's just so much mystery in that. There's just that feels like magic to me. That feels. I think it's one of the reasons I'm a fan of your work. It's just that I feel like you've always had a way of projecting the personal into the physical renderings of the characters who you're representing. And I wonder if that is an element of some of the cartoonists who influenced you. I mean, you spoke about it in terms of fiction writers you like, but I'm curious to know if there were cartoonists whose work you saw that quality in and thought, oh yeah, that's something that I want, that represents something that I want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Every cartoonist that I've ever been a fan of, that's the kind of the through line through all of it, from something as mainstream and commercial as Peanuts by Charles Schulz, up to current day artists like Chris Ware.
Yeah.
I think that it's interesting because now I can go back and look at the comics that I liked as a kid, and there was a long period where I was just like everyone else at my age. I was reading superhero comics, and when I go back and look at the ones that still have resonance for me versus the ones that I just am happy to throw away, it's that same thing where I feel like an artist like there's a guy named Steve Ditko who created Spider-Man and ended up becoming a very solitary, eccentric guy living in Times Square, I believe. But he was doing it was like a job. It was like, here's the story, I got to turn it into a comic and meet the monthly deadline. And I go back and look at those comics, and I feel like this is just as personal as so-called alternative comics that are being produced in my lifetime.
Right. And that's incredible. I mean, that's part of probably what makes it so memorable, part of what makes it endure.
Of course. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that just is true in my taste in art in general, whether it's film or music or writing. That's important to me. And I know that's, I say, to me, that seems like common sense, but I know that's also not a top priority for other people. I know that there's a way to enjoy art that is totally divorced from that, and that's interesting to me too.
Yeah, well, I am curious about the way those lines of influence run and the way that we sort of imbibe um, things that are meaningful to us in each other's work. I mean, I've thought a lot about, you mentioned getting together in Berkeley with some other cartoonist friends of yours, and specifically, I know that you had kind of um, a regular lunch or dinner meeting going with Dan Clowes and Richard Sala.
Right.
And I'd really love to hear you talk a little bit about the artistic relationship that existed between the three of you, especially in light of the fact that we recently lost Richard. He died May 7th at the age of 65, was it? Seems so young.
Yeah.
Your styles are so different. I can see more commonalities between your work and Dan's, but Richard's work was really quite unusual. And I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about, what were some of your conversations like? What did you guys talk about?
Yeah.
What was it like to look at each other's work at that time, and how do you think your lines of influence might have run?
Yeah, I mean, it's a topic that I could talk forever about, because it was so formative for me. But just to give a little background, I moved from Sacramento to Berkeley to go to college when I was 18, and I had already been just a massive alternative and underground comic fan, and I had been buying the work of Dan and Richard, and I corresponded with Dan through the mail, and just by pure random chance, I ended up, after 1 year in the dorms, I ended up moving into an apartment on College Avenue that happened to be equidistant from both Dan and Richard, who were also living on College Avenue at the time. And we actually were introduced by Dan's wife, who was a classmate of mine at Berkeley. And I think starting right then, when I was, I guess, a sophomore in college, probably for the next 10 or so years, the three of us would get together for lunch every Wednesday, and we'd get a gross, like, diner kind of breakfast lunch, and then go do some kind of errand. I think really we wanted to just sit and talk to each other, but it felt weird to just spend so much time just sitting and talking. So we would invent an errand, like we would go to the comic book store together, or we would go to the art store, or we would go look at used bookstores or something like that. And I have zero memory of any of the junk that I bought on any of those expeditions, but I have crystal clear memories of the conversations we had while we were looking around at things and buying things, and sitting there afterwards having a coffee or something. And I've in the past I've described it as sort of my very cheap version of art school. I feel like I learned so much about what I was trying to do at the time, which was become a professional cartoonist. And I learned really concrete, like physical, like hands-on stuff. Like I remember once going over to Dan's house, and we were going to go out and get something to eat. And he said, like, I don't want to push, but do you mind if I just show you a little trick that's always been really helpful for me about drawing backgrounds in perspective?
You're kidding.
And
what
I
was
said,
it?
Well, it was. I mean, it's hard to just describe on a podcast, but I said, yeah, actually, there's nothing that would make me happier. And he sat down and got out his drawing supplies and showed me this thing that I'm like, literally right now I'm working on a New Yorker cover, and I'm using the exact technique that he taught me. But it also was more broad and like a lot of conversations just about how to live as an artist and how to manage being married with being obsessive with your work. So I had these two friends who were older than me and had experienced and dealt with so many things that were still kind of on the horizon for me. I wasn't married. I didn't have a family. I wasn't making a living off my work. I wasn't trying to balance between being an illustrator and a cartoonist. I hadn't dealt with any of the business stuff yet. I mean, they taught me about how to be a self-employed person and set money aside for taxes, which had never occurred to me. And then, Dan also ventured into the world of Hollywood a long time ago, and I got to learn a lot from that. And I'm constantly getting his advice, and pretty much any move I make in regard to that industry, I run by him first. And so it was a long education, and it's something that I still rely on. And and like you said, Dan's influence is very much more visible in my work. But Richard was a huge part of that, and I think it was. I think it was just a matter of, like I'd already set on a path that was a little more similar to Dan's style, and it was easier for me to steal from him and to emulate him. Whereas when I was at that point in my career, if I started incorporating Richard Sala techniques, it would have seemed very conspicuous. And but again, he was even older than Dan, and had been in the business for even longer. I think he was sort of a bit of a veteran already by the time Dan met him, and he was like, "Oh, I can't believe I'm living down the street from Richard Sala." And so I got to say that when I was thinking back on all this, when Richard died, one of the things that came to mind was that the humility of the fact that Richard was already an established name, had done animation for MTV, and had an incredible illustration career and cartooning and everything. And he always treated me and Dan as equals, if not his mentors or his superiors in some strange way. I definitely don't think that I have that natural inclination, and I just really admired, especially in hindsight, thinking like what a kind of cocky idiot I was when I met him. and not once did I get the impression that he was put off by it, or never did he feel the need to kind of put me in my place or pull rank or anything like that. And aside from all the artistic things that I described, I think as a person, that's something that's really inspired me going forward.
Well, and maybe that's one of the reasons it's important to have relationships that are, if you're developing as an artist, to have relationships that are not codified by academia, because if one person is labeled as professor and the other person is labeled as student, then maybe in a way it kind of limits the kind of relationship that you would be naturally inclined to have artistically with one another. Yeah. But it seems that the beauty of what you guys were doing was that you were kind of just living artistic lives in proximity to each other. Yeah. And so there was this natural kind of exchange of ideas that was taking place that would allow for experiences that were directly, direct teaching experiences, like what you just described Dan doing when he was showing you how to render perspective in a particular way, and that we're also kind of this indirect teaching that just has to do with watching somebody else live a life that's a little bit farther down the line, chronologically speaking.
Oh yeah, I mean, both have been invaluable to me, but I feel like, if I don't draw the background in this illustration properly, very few people will notice. But the other things, I think, will impact other people in my life, in terms of interpersonal lessons, like I said, they both were married before me. They lost family members before me. Dan had children before me. All these kind of, and even they went through health scares. All these things that I've definitely been able to learn from and get their advice about. And I think that's the kind of stuff that will really have a ripple effect throughout my life. Like, I think my kids will benefit from it. I think my marriage will benefit from it, and my relationship to my parents will benefit from it.
And in the case of this new book, it seems like your work is benefiting directly from that too, because this book, especially as it progresses, really becomes about how our mortality gives us perspective on everything else we do in our lives. And so it kind of seems like, in a way, you are passing along that teaching, which is one of the things I really loved about it. I wonder if, as I see we're kind of running towards the end of our time, if there's anything that you might want to transmit. I mean, it sounds like you received over the course of many years some really great pieces of advice, but for writers or cartoonists who are coming up now, is there any one practical thing that you think is important to keep in mind, or anything that can really help people move to a place of greater seriousness with their work?
Well, I think one major change that's happened within the world of cartooning in recent years is that it has become a slightly viable career. Like, there is enough money involved in it that some people can make a living off it, and a few people can get very rich at it. And I think that completely altered the landscape, because when I started, there was no hope of any of that. There was no fame. There was no money. A lot of the people who were doing it at the top of their game also were working at an art store, or were waiting tables or something like that. And in a lot of ways, I encourage young artists to try and put themselves in the mindset of before this whole revolution, and to make sure that they're doing it for the reasons of wanting to do it themselves, or more importantly, needing to do it, as opposed to thinking that it could be a stepping stone to an animated TV show, or that it could make you famous on the internet, or something like that, which even now feels strange to even be saying. But I think the best work in the history of comics came out of a very real kind of personal motivation. Even someone like Charles Schulz, who became so successful and so famous. I honestly think that even if you were to have taken away all the money and the fame and the merchandise and all that, I still think that he would get up every morning and still crank out that comic strip.
Oh yeah, it seemed to come from a place of such personal necessity.
Yeah.
And you really need that, I think, in order to weather the inevitable embarrassments and disappointments and setbacks that will come.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that it made me think of when I was thinking back to Dan and Richard was when I was spending all that time with them, they were kind of like my old guy friends. And I also had kind of a broader range of more like peers, like young people, at least closer to my age group, who were kind of at the same place in their career. And I remember just always, when I would kind of move between the two worlds, I remember being so aware of how competitive the younger group could be sometimes, and how it could sometimes be hard for them to be happy for another person's success, or kind of viewing other people's work through the prism of well, I did that better, or I did that first, or something like that. And then it was always such a great relief to then go back to the other world with these older cartoonists. And I can say with honesty that there was no competitiveness there. They weren't looking over their shoulder at what someone else was getting. And I think that really speaks to how deeply connected they were with their own work, and just that they had absolute conviction that they were doing what they had to do, that it was something that had to come out, and that they were going to work as hard as they could. And I think that that sort of diluted some of those feelings of if you did the work that you absolutely believed in, and that you put your heart into, and it didn't sell quite as many copies as someone else. I don't think that stings as much as if you were conscious of that the whole time and thinking, how can I craft this so that I can get in on some of the success that so-and-so is having?
Yeah, that's right. Because it seems like what it comes down to for people who are committed to it in the way you're talking about is the compulsion, the sense of necessity around rendering human experience, translating one's own experience into either a form that communicates through other characters to a reader, or one that does much of what I see you doing in this current book, which is just kind of like placing your own observations, your own life, the raw intimacy of your experience as honestly on the page as possible, not only to show accurately who you are and what your own experience is like, but also to draw lines of connection between all of us.
Yeah,
So,
and of course, I'm sure you're aware of this too, that you also want people to be cognizant of business things, but I think it's just a strange twist that in the early days of my career, everybody I knew was a dedicated artist and were devoted to the work, but they were terrible business people, and they had no sense of managing their career, and they were getting audited, and they were, they had no idea what to do if Hollywood came calling or anything like that. And there were a lot of heartbreaking stories of people getting taken advantage of or whatever. And I think now it's almost, the pendulum has swung so far where people are so savvy about that stuff, and they are so attuned to the ideas of marketing and having agents and having, a presence online and all these things. Whenever I go to talk to an undergraduate art class, the questions are always about those things, and right. I feel like like there's a lot of information about that now, and it's important to also not lose sight of the other side of the business or the art form.
Yeah, I'm curious to know whether you think, and I'm saying that we should probably wrap it up after this maybe, but I'm curious to know whether you feel like living in this current moment where we've had, first of all, the major life reorganization of the pandemic, and then the political reorganization around Black Lives Matter and racial awareness, whether those two factors working together are going to change the focus for people who in the past were maybe more business oriented. I mean, I feel like it's already created a kind of reorganization or reprioritization for me inside the body of work that I'm thinking of doing next. But what does that mean literally? Like, how is that going to manifest in your work? Well, I guess one effect maybe that the current political moment is having is that well, not only does this vast scale reminder of our own mortality make me feel all the more urgency about getting the work done. I think I also feel like more bravery is needed somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Like one of the books that I just embarked on, the novel that I've just embarked on, is about growing up in New Orleans and becoming aware of the way race manifests in the South. And I felt a lot of trepidation around venturing into this subject because it's so complicated and it's so fraught. But it also kind of seems like we can't wait. We have to tell our own truths now so that we can, make the change happen that it's clear we all need,
That's, I mean, I'm glad to hear you say that, because I think that's going to be one of the strange repercussions, I think, for a while, is that while some people are feeling emboldened and more daring in certain ways, I think there's also a way in which that some people can start to feel a little petrified of misstepping to the point of shutting down artistic ideas that they think might run the risk of getting them in trouble, or getting involved in a debate that they don't feel comfortable engaging in. And so, I think that's a great idea, and I hope that people, especially the artists that I admire, can withstand that and not shy away from the really important and interesting subject matter because of that fear of, a negative tweet or something like that.
Yeah, well, in a way, I feel like our discomfort needs to be our guide.
Mm-hmm.
If we feel comfortable, then we're probably not pushing the conversation enough,
Yeah.
And that's what's got to happen if there's actually going to be a shift. I can't be afraid to write about how I was taught to perceive race when I was, 7 years old in New Orleans.
Right.
Right. And I was.
And I hope along with that, that I hope that's a path that artists take. But I also hope that as an audience, that we can make an effort to be open to points of view or thoughts that don't 100% align with our own beliefs.
Well, I think that's a great place for us to rest. Adrian, I'm so grateful to you for talking to me. It's just been so cool to have this new sort of line of insight into your work.
Well, thank you so much. I owe you so much in many ways, but I really appreciated this conversation, and it felt a lot more neighborly than the typical interview.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, Adrian, for this incredible conversation. Julie Orringer's most recent book is The Flight Portfolio, which is published by Knopf and is available now. Adrian Tomine is the author of The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Cartoonist, which is published by Drawn and Quarterly and is available July 21st. Bookable is a production of Loud Tree Media. I'm your host, Amanda Stern, 5 feet tall, but 5'1" when illustrated. We're produced by me, Bo Friedlander, and Andrew Dunn, who also mixes and sound designs the show. Bo is Loudtree's editor-in-chief. Find us on the web at bookablepod.com and subscribe and rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your shows. That's one of the best ways for other listeners to find Bookable. We're back next week with another episode, and we will see you then. This is Bookable. Hey guys, it's Amanda, here to tell you about a new podcast from the producers of Forever 35 called Gee Thanks, Just Bought It. Hosted by author and shopping guru Caroline Moss, Gee Thanks, Just Bought It shares all the life-changing, under-the-radar products you didn't think you needed. What do I mean by that, you ask? Well, how about hand warmers that double as phone chargers, foot hammocks, fake shirt collars, the perfect spatula, full-face ice masks, yeah, they exist, and much more. Her mission is not to get you to buy everything, but to hear from trusted guests about the products you may be looking for. Listen to New York Times bestselling author Ellen Hillebrand on why you need a pepper grinder, Birchbox co-founder Molly Chen on her tiny tongs obsession, and author-comedian Samantha Irby's favorite travel bidet. And of course, we'll hear from the guru herself on something she's loving that week. Shop and subscribe now to Gee Thanks, Just Bought It, wherever you listen to podcasts.